EVPs and mystical stories? How does our brain translate this information? Can these events be scientifically explained? Is telepathy a primordial language? And why do lamps swing in the moment that a poltergeist is presenting itself? I am Maria Anna van Driel, and you are listening to the Next Truth podcasts. Let's ask questions. Do you also have questions about what may lay beyond our ordinary vision, time, and reality? What is it that is dwelling in the afterlife? Is there an afterlife? Recently, I had a very interesting conversation with paranormal researcher from PRI-UK, Nick Howe. And he took me through a quantum universe, seeking the answers of what may contain the afterlife. So, sit back and let your mind run over this theory of quantum immortality. And if this theory might be the answer for the question of what is a ghost.
Yeah, that's a
I don't
fun.
know. Why do they swing lamps?
Yes, Nick, PRI-UK research, paranormal research. That one particular question that I am running around for a couple of years already. Why do poltergeists always swing lamps? Do you know? Have you an answer? Can you reveal that answer to me?
No, I can't. It's a simple question. It's a simple
Then
question. It's a
this interview is
simple answer.
over.
But
This interview is over. Okay, no, that is silly. But it is in, well, people say or show in, for instance, YouTube clips and also in movies, lamps are always swinging. And I just cannot figure out what this means. What do people mean with that? What if a poltergeist is doing this and making itself known in one way or another? Always that always happens.
yeah,
Do you have an idea, perhaps, that pops up in your
I
mind?
think, to be quite honest, our experience has been that there are no swinging lamps.
No.
Of all the cases we've investigated, it's an interesting question because of all the cases we've actually investigated, I can't actually think of anybody saying the lamps are swinging. So either people's decor has changed over the years and light fittings are more fixed and they don't have that sort of pendant type fitting anymore. Yeah. I don't know. It's a very good question, but there are other factors which we are finding. There do seem to be some common themes, but that's one I think we'll have to watch out for. And but yeah, I wonder whether it is that, you know, the idea of the pendant lighting is I don't know, perhaps not as common as it used to be. Maybe, I don't know. Something we'd have to research, and that's obviously something that we do. You know, we're not just investigating, we're researching as well. So what you've actually put to me is an interesting point, and I'll take that away with me. But our experience recently of poltergeist activity has been more the movement of items, not so much, you know, a lamp or something like that, but personal possessions. And quite often it's not just moving but disappearing, sometimes coming back and sometimes not. So if we are looking at some sort of movement in terms of poltergeist activity, it seems to be focused very much at the moment on personal possessions, and that's certainly a common theme. We've got two cases that we're investigating at the moment, very similar in terms of their dynamics. The oldish, middle-aged, oldish couples, separated from previous partners and about to get married again. And
Yes.
lo and behold, that is exactly what's been happening to both of them. So what we're finding is that you get ornaments and they get rearranged in some form or fashion, which is a bit odd. But then some of the things that, certainly in one particular case, the gentleman actually collects Zippo lighters, you know, the gas type lighters, in a cabinet. They're not on display and they disappear quite regularly, but then come back again. Unfortunately, his partner, she had some figures, I think they were of dogs, on a mantelpiece. They've disappeared and not come back. And with another couple, very odd, that one of the first things they experienced or became aware of was the fact that bath towels disappeared quite regularly, and that's a bit of a puzzle, isn't it? I mean, why bath towels? But lo and behold, they live in a bungalow, so it's a single-story building. He happened to be going into the loft sometime afterwards, and he found the bath towels in the loft. They don't go into the loft. You know, he said that was probably the first time he'd actually been in the loft for goodness knows how many years. And also what was missing, that turned up with the bath towels, was she collects the Betty Boop type figures and anything to do with Betty Boop. You know, it's just one of those things. And she had a key ring, and the key ring was on the bath towels, which were nicely folded up for them. But what on earth is that all about? You know, so you know, it's interesting you say about the swinging lamp, but again, we'll take that away. We'll think about that, and we might ask a few questions, and we might get some answers. But it does seem to be items, personal possessions, disappearing and reappearing sometimes.
Hauntings,
Right.
EVPs, mystical visions. How does our brain translate these eerie moments? Can they be scientifically explained? And is telepathy a primordial but natural human language? Hello and welcome to the new series of the Next Truth podcast, Let's Ask Questions. Today I'm welcoming back a dedicated paranormal researcher from the UK, Nick Howe, whose view is that more rational approach has to be taken into a paranormal investigation, and one that is respecting the client's opinion and privacy. Nick, welcome back. Unfortunately, your colleague could not be here. He had some obligations for his work. But Nick, welcome back. It has been a while since we have spoken. So can you tell us what you have been doing in the past, I believe it's the past year already, and which kind of investigations that you have been doing and perhaps are going to do?
Right. Okay. It's interesting. I think actually it's probably more than a year since we last sort of spoke, or we did something with the Next Truth. So it's great to be talking to you again, Marie. It's great. Always good talking to you. What's been happening? Well, our experience, and I say our experience, well, I'm talking about Andy, myself, and Paranormal Research Investigators UK, is that during COVID, we seem to have a lot more inquiries than we did before. Now, it could be that, you know, for some reason we're more visible to people, I don't know. But I think the general feeling is that because of lockdown, people have been spending far more time at home. I think probably experiencing their homes in a slightly different way. And I think that's an important thing to bear in mind.
Yeah.
So I think generally, yes, we believe people. We'd never say you're lying or anything like that, unless, of course, you know, there's proof, and that's very difficult anyway. But anyway, but I think generally what's actually happened is that people are spending more time at home, perhaps watching a bit more TV. So many ghost programs or investigation programs, you know, the paranormal investigation, and I think it's sort of triggered a little bit of a kind of interest. And people have become very conscious, as I say, about their own surroundings, their own fears and anxieties, and they're suddenly sort of thinking, that was odd. I've never heard that noise before. Wow, you know, what's going on? Now, I think that would be very simplistic to say that. I think that generally what we're finding is that perhaps the tension, the anxiety of being at home, the fear of COVID and everything else has actually triggered perhaps some psychological factors. But it's not a case that we're disbelieving people. I think people are just more tuned into it. And I think what we're trying to get to is, one, trying to overcome that fear with people, and trying to explain to them that a lot of people are having the same sort of experiences. That's one thing. And I think once they can come to terms with these things, then actually their experiences become a little bit more easy for them, and the anxiety tends to disappear. And quite often we find that we're almost like a sort of, I hesitate to use the word doctors in the sense, but we're almost treating the symptoms that they're experiencing.
That was what's popping up in my mind. It almost sounds as if you are dimensional psychologists when you speak about it like this.
Yeah, and I think the thing is that when you talk to people, I mean, what triggers a lot of fear in people? They hear noises, things are moving, perhaps, or they put things down, they can't find them, things appear, you know, all sorts of things like this. Shadow figures, I think that's another sort of factor. People see things within their peripheral vision. They're already sort of, I think, primed because of, you know, this fact that they're in their homes or have been in their homes, perhaps a bit locked up, really. Excuse me. So this anxiety is built up, and quite often what we're trying to do is say to these people, look, you know, what harm are these things actually doing to you? Because the sort of their thinking becomes that they're sharing their homes with an unknown entity, and that in itself creates a lot of fear. And they think, well, what can these things do to us? And the actual answer at the end of the day is probably not a lot. I mean, we come across people that feel that they've been scratched, touched, bitten even, excuse me. But at the end of the day, talking to these people and going over these things and saying, look, you know, it's a nuisance, but actually what harm is being done to you? And I think suddenly they can almost come to terms with this idea that as long as they're not just, they're experiencing these things by themselves, that other people are having them, you know, that they're not mad. I mean, again, that's a quite another common thing. I thought I was going mad when I heard all these things going on. I had these experiences, and it just relieves a lot of their pressure, their anxiety, and their fear. And quite often, actually, once they can get over that and sort of come to terms with it, it's quite interesting how a lot of the activity seems to die down. Of course, you could argue that perhaps with poltergeist activity, it does actually reach a peak. You know, it is something which will build up and then eventually fade away. It might come back, it might not, but sort of the feelings are, excuse me, that perhaps, you know, that they've come to terms with it, and a lot of these things are actually sort of fade away into the background.
When I'm listening to you, it sounds like that electrical devices are being more used in the moments that people are going into lockdowns, And we all know that, for instance, a flat screen TV has this odd transmission of electromagnetic waves and electricity. When you
Yep.
put your hand against it, you feel the warmth. You can even stick a balloon to your television, and there's that electricity. Do you think that, for instance, using more electrical devices, as well as coffee machines and cell phones, while people are being at home that much, is triggering this phenomena of, for instance, shadow figures or stuff falling from the wall? So that it doesn't mean it has to be a poltergeist per se.
Again, I think that's a very interesting point. One of the things that we do, we don't like using equipment when we go on an investigation. The reason being that, as far as we're concerned, there's nothing that will actually detect a ghost as such. But what we will do is we'll try and gauge the natural phenomena. One of the devices that we do use an EMF meter, but it is a commercial meter. It's not designed for ghost hunting as such. So of course what we can do is we can plug it into a laptop. It'll record the data. We can draw graphs out of it. But so we've got tangible documents saying, look, this is a sweep of your property. More often than not, the levels that we record or we're seeing are what you'd expect in a domestic environment. But what you do find occasionally are some hotspots. And it's an interesting point that you're saying, about TVs. I mean, one of the worst, as far as I can see, are things like your Wi-Fi router. Yes. I mean, if you get an EMF meter near one of those, it's going off the scale. Other things that we've actually found was it was an aquarium. It had a pump in it, the oxygen pumps that could oxygenate the water. And again, it was going off the scale. Now, in terms of going off the scale, my understanding and from my sort of research is that really your domestic appliances give off about 1 milligauss of EMF, electromagnetic field. But anything getting about 6 can actually start causing some sort of interference with the body, and certainly anything above 12 is getting a little bit sort of naughty, and you should not expose yourself to those sort of levels for any length of time. This was giving off a reading, this is going back to the aquarium, this was going back to over 12, and when I mentioned it to this particular person, he said, well, that's interesting, because it was at the end of a settee. He's sitting at the end of the settee, that's where he sat during his evenings, when he's sitting down watching television or relaxing, doing whatever he was going to be doing. And so he was actually exposing himself to relatively high levels of EMF. And you have to say, well, shield yourself from it or move it or do something. Yeah. Equally, a similar case where we were called into an apartment. And again, it was the woman was sort of sitting at the end of the settee. That's where she would relax. That's her sort of spot. And again, we sort of read, or we were getting extremely high readings. And we said, well, where? Because it was an apartment. What's at the back of this? Because it's not a room. It wasn't actually joining another property or anything like that. And actually, it was where the power came into the building. So there was like the fuse board was effectively for the whole building was literally inches away from her head. So he said, well, you need to speak to somebody to shield that, because that's where she would sit in the evening. And of course, these things will trigger feelings of anxiety, and in some cases, as far as I understand, hallucination as well. So that's why, when we go into an investigation, we're basically saying, look, we're not disbelieving, not saying you're lying, but what we will do is we will look at everything that we think could possibly cause the events that you're describing and hopefully put them down to a natural phenomena anyway. And with some success.
maybe sometimes a little bit disappointed for some people, but it's better to know if there is a natural cause or an electrical cause
Yeah.
for what you
Yeah.
are experiencing, meaning that you do not have to be afraid for something that wasn't there in the first place.
Exactly.
Now this is a technical explanation. I mean, by means of devices, some visions can be created unnaturally. But there are also people, and I've witnessed this myself a couple of times, when you walk outside or plain daylight or just in an evening on a summer night, and then suddenly just out of the corners of your eyes, or you see something flashing in front of your eyes, a black mass.
Yeah.
How do you explain something like that? Because at that moment, I do not have a cell phone. I do not own one. I do not have one with me. But sometimes these things happen. So how can you explain these things, these moments?
I'd love to be able to explain it, to be quite honest. But again, it's just a very common feature. Now, whether it's anything to do with our peripheral vision, whether there's a trigger, primordial, reaction to something that you're seeing out of the corner of your eye, part of the fight or flight syndrome, I think it's
mostly fleeing for me.
But I mean, the thing is, these things are natural. That they are part of our defense mechanism. We will react to a lot of things, and when somebody starts getting frightened, it's amazing how that fear not can only affect them, but those people around them as well. It's almost like a mass hysteria. But coming back to your point, I think that, again, part of our research does indicate that a lot of people have these experiences. Now, it's not uncommon, for people to have these experiences and refer to them as being hauntings. So again, you've got to ask yourself, is this a kind of bit of information so they understand that this is what happens when people think they have a haunting or whatever you want to call it, so therefore they experience it themselves? Is it actually something? Is there something paranormal happening, or is it just a reaction to something that they understand as being part of their fear?
Do you think that it is a primordial skill that we have given this by our ancestors, that is still in our DNA, to scan our environment for dangerous stuff, so that we can fight, flee, or in most cases freeze, but that it is a primordial language, or that it's just built in our DNA?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. We tend to forget that we are animals, and I think the thing is that we are programmed to some extent. I mean, how much longer we will exist in the form that we have at the moment? I mean, some people say it's limited to a few years. Let's hope it's a bit longer than that. But I think when you think of the thousands of years of our evolution, it's not that long ago that we were sort of basic animals. We've elevated ourselves to this position. We seem to have developed our IQ, although sometimes that is debatable, and I'm sure a lot of people would ask.
Yeah, we'll pick that one up. We haven't heard it. Okay, fine. Anyway, but please go on. Yes.
But I think the thing is that we tend to forget that we would have been, not so many thousands of years ago, walking around with animals leaping out at us. We would have been the prey invariably, and we've developed these instincts, and they're still part of us. And I think there is an element, an innate tendency to look at things, smell things. It's our senses. I mean, we tend to think that we're quite highly evolved, but when you think of the dogs and how they can smell and everything else, we're very ordinary. And so therefore, perhaps we do tend to have to be a little bit more wary about our surroundings, and there are things that will actually trigger fear or anxiety quite easily, and I think we have to take that into account. I think misperception is probably 95% of what people think is paranormal. You know, they see things or experience things, and it's probably nothing more than, you know, a noise that can be explained. You don't have that explanation. And of course, you know, everybody knows about pareidolia, you know, this idea that we can see images. I mean, that's very much part of our brain processing what comes through our eyes. It can apply to sound as well. You know, there's some great examples of recordings that people will play back and say, did you hear that? You can hear this word, you can hear that word. And somebody else will listen to it and say, well, actually, I can't. Yeah. You know, what on earth, how on earth are you getting that? And equally, you know, we record things. Again, this is something else we're now experiencing. We've entered the digital age. Everybody's got a digital recorder, either it's on their phone or wherever it is. And we record these sounds, but we don't actually necessarily analyze them. And I'm going to be a big bore here because we did do an investigation recently, and I was listening to a recording. What we tend to do is we don't take handwritten notes. We sort of go and say, look, do you mind? We're going to record, you know, this so that we've got points of reference, and we can concentrate on what you're saying rather than trying to write it down. Mm-hmm. Anyway, yes. I was listening to this recording, and in fact, I had it on loudspeaker. It was on the laptop, and my wife was with me, and suddenly heard this noise, and she said, I didn't know they had a dog, these people you went to visit. And at exactly the same moment that I'm thinking, that sounded like a dog barking.
Yes.
That's weird. Anyway, fortunately, Andy and one of our colleagues, James, was recording. And actually what it was they had cats. It was a cat bowl. I think they put it's a metal bowl on the kitchen floor. Somebody kicked it. One sounded like my recorder, a dog barking, woof, woof. On their recorders, it was the sound of a bowl being scraped along the floor, or somebody sort of caught it with their foot. So it wasn't necessarily pareidolia, but on the other hand, the recordings that we picked up were completely different sounds. You know, one recorder made it sound like a dog barking, as ridiculous as that might actually seem. The other thing was that the bowl, and obviously, and I think it was Andy that kicked it, was able to say, well, actually, I can remember it was the cat's bowl, you know, and that's simple. So, you know, we like to jump to conclusions as well. You know, it's not just a case of what's actually been triggered and what is happening on it around us. It's sometimes even the stuff that we've actually recorded, you have to sort of question and be very careful about, because it might sound like something, on the other hand, it's probably something else.
So it fully depends on the frequencies that has been or have been captured, and which frequencies your ears and your brain can translate into, or images or in words, what you perceive.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah.
So then now I'm also thinking about when I just asked you about a primordial language for humans, when you step into a dark place, or we as Neanderthals, or perhaps a species before that, stepping into a cave, immediately your DNA, everything inside of you says, watch out for danger. And in the moment that your brain is translating that, there is most likely danger, because you need to fight or flee.
Yes.
So transporting that to a modern time, you have paranormal investigators stepping into a dark room and suddenly see everything that might not be there. So now I'm also thinking, is it possible? Do you think it's possible? This is a very scientific, neuroscience question.
Don't
Do
ask
you
me that one then.
Well, I'll try to keep it brief. Do you think that it is possible that our brain waves, when we step into a dark place, depending what it is, regardless of what it is, we step into that and our brain waves are suddenly amplified,
Mhm.
and we admit these into the room, and everything is coming back and bouncing off everything and back to you, etc., so that by means of these brain waves we sending out, we create, for instance, a shadow figure. You think that is possible, that
I
the
think so.
brainwave is
Yeah.
strong enough with it?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, whether it's actually a physical effect, whether it is a psychological effect, whether it's something that's being transmitted or communicated to other people. And as I say, the mass hysteria might be a bit extreme, but it's surprising how quickly a group of people can sort of whip themselves up into a frenzy.
Yeah.
And I would be careful, because the thing is that in talking about energies that we emit ourselves, our bodies, yes, there are energies that can be recorded, but I don't think there's any scientific evidence which actually suggests that they can be broadcast effectively and received by other people. So I'm thinking in terms of telepathy. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist, but on the other hand, I think we just have to be a little bit careful, because a lot of people jump on this bandwagon and start saying, "Oh, well, of course, it's the energies around the, they need to absorb my energy." Well, what I keep saying is, well, what energy is it that needs to be absorbed, and what energy is it that these beings that are feeding off? I mean, it could be true. I mean, I don't know, but at the moment, our science doesn't actually point in that direction, and I think that where we have to be careful, and I think we do, perhaps when we do our investigations, we listen to people. We don't doubt them. We don't question them or challenge them. We might sort of try and recreate things, but I think the point is that what we find more interesting are the things that are sort of measurable, in the sense, and it's coming back to this thing about the movement of items.
Yes.
Where perhaps personal possessions go missing, or items appear or reappear, or and I think that's the thing that sort of brings it back to a kind of something which is tangible, because we don't certainly have the equipment, and we certainly don't have the expertise to measure brainwaves. And so really, as paranormal investigators at the moment, we try and rely on the sort of the physical evidence rather than, I suppose, what you might say, potentially psychological evidence.
Perhaps Dr. Radin has an answer. I don't know if you
Yeah.
know him.
Yes.
Perhaps
Yeah.
he has some ideas or devices that can measure the energy transmitted by people in the moment that they step into a dark room, or when a particular mass hysteria, because it doesn't have to be negative at all, it can also be positive, that he can measure this. When you say,
sorry, just coming back to that you say about this, Professor Chris French, who's recently retired. He was at Goldsmiths University. He's a psychologist, and he's very skeptical in the sense that he believes a lot, if not all, as my understanding, of what people are actually experiencing is actually a psychological effect and not actually paranormal. So there are other people out there, and I guess most scientists actually probably are very skeptical anyway.
I'm not of the same opinion. I know a couple of scientists who truly believe that it is all possible, but are a little bit on the safe side. Of course, we do not want to make mistakes and say silly stuff, and then a few minutes later we go flat face on the concrete.
Science is littered with it in the past. I'm not a scientist. I mean, I don't claim to be a scientist. I just have an interest. But I think the thing is that when you do look at science, it has become very narrow. And I think that's sometimes a bit, when you hear people say there are no such things as ghosts, without even just defining what a ghost could possibly be, I mean, it gets down to that sort of level. And you do sometimes think, well, that's not necessarily a very scientific approach in itself. But philosophy and science, they went their separate ways years and years ago. And I think the thing is that our experiences now and our expectations are that scientists are slightly more objective rather than subjective.
Plato's cave. I think that science and philosophy should be combined in one way or another. When in the beginning we spoke about poltergeist and swinging lamps, why that it is, and you mentioned this case in where you have, I believe it was investigated that two people have experienced that towels, for instance, were replaced and folded again somewhere else. I was thinking, and I'm coming back to that, quantum immortality. Quantum immortality is the theory that there are multiverses.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes, right.
Yes, and when you die in this reality,
yes.
your other you is still alive in another universe or universes. So I was thinking, when you mentioned this question, what is a ghost? And I was thinking, if quantum immortality is fact, that it is possible, we are in different kinds of universes. When parallel planes are starting to shift or starting to cross each other, that we are meeting ourselves or beloved ones we have lost here or are still even here, but from another universe are coming here. Clumsy as we are as a human species, we might also be clumsy in another galaxy, in another universe, that we are knocking over chairs or knocking a painting from the wall, or bump our heads against a light or a lamp that is in the other universe. It's not there.
Yeah.
Do you think that this could be possible explanation for poltergeist activity?
Yes. Yeah, I agree. I think you look for a rational explanation. I suppose it's part of our dilemma, isn't it, as being human beings, that we're always asking this question. And I think the thing is that the way I look at it, and slightly different point of view perhaps, is that we've moved away from, I think, the supernatural, and we are now looking at the paranormal. So what we're saying is that there will eventually be an explanation. And I think, again, you've got to perhaps bear in mind that everybody will have their own theories, and I certainly have my own theories. I have my own beliefs. Not necessarily anything to do with ghosts and poltergeists, but in terms of perhaps even religion. I'm not a religious person. I don't believe in God. I'm not sure that I actually believe in the afterlife, and that might be heretical for a lot of people out there, to say, oh, that's what ghosts are. But actually, I think the explanation that you've given is one that holds water for me, because the trouble is that if I don't believe in God, then I can't believe really in an afterlife. My sort of logic, my thinking goes along that way. If there's no afterlife, then obviously that cuts out the very basic definition of what a ghost is, because a ghost is meant to be the spirit of a deceased person. That is just one definition. I mean, now there are so many, it's unbelievable. So I think if you take out, as I say, the supernatural, then you have to start looking at things perhaps a bit more rational, perhaps more scientific. And I think that the more that we begin to understand about multiverses, parallel universes and the like, the spin-offs, the fact that there are probably, and unfortunately, and I'll make no apologies, there could be millions of me out there in this sort of whatever it is that we live in. Why not? Why shouldn't it be that we're actually bumping into each other, or we're overloading, or there's some sort of crossover? And that seems to be, for me, the rational explanation. The other odd thing about, I think, the paranormal, and we do say this, that you try and look for patterns of why things happen, and there are patterns. I said the moving objects and the other, but we also have to ask ourselves, why should this be? Why would something actually want to remove, say, that chap's Zippo lighter and then replace it?
Yes.
So the question then is, the cosmic joker theory, that there is some sort of different layer, that there are perhaps, in a different dimensions, these other beings that will actually sort of come into our world and basically, I suppose, have jokes. I don't know, wind people up. You think of a description or a way of actually putting it. So, it becomes, I think, quite broad, in the sense that if you put aside the supernatural and you look at the paranormal, then okay, that's fine. Yes, the interaction, but then there does seem to be an element of malice with a lot of the things that actually happen. And if you look at malice, people being scratched. I mean, why would somebody be scratched by something that just crossed over from a different dimension? So
Yeah, well,
again, but then it then comes back, well, is that demonic? Well, again, from my perspective, I'm saying I don't believe in the supernatural. So I'm not necessarily saying there are demons out there, in a sort of religious sense. But
yes.
but actually you start to think, well, perhaps there are other beings that cross over, and it's not just an interaction with ourselves, human beings.
Simply because you do not know what is going on in a parallel universe.
Exactly.
Or universes.
Yeah.
It could be that a dog was crossing, or that just popping up into our reality. Started to, because it was hungry, I don't know, or a cat that scared itself by bumping into us. So yeah, it could be.
Yes.
It is a very interesting idea to answer this question with this idea, with this philosophy, with this theory of the answer of what is a ghost.
Yes.
Are we our own ghosts?
Yeah.
Or even when you think one step further, are we our own aliens?
That's a possibility. UFOs, encounters, you name it. It comes back to that. The other thing is, of course, you start. I know this is getting a bit ethereal, but you start looking in terms of folklore. And the weird things that people have experienced. Okay, we tend to think of perhaps ghosts, UFOs, aliens, but then think of all the other woodland creatures, the trolls, everything else that people have in their cultures, which suggests that there are perhaps other types of being that actually coexist alongside us. Now, whether that is in a sort of the reality, our time, or whether again there's a crossover, again it does actually raise that question. And again, I think it's quite a fascinating one as well, because the idea that there could perhaps be fairies or goblins, elves, you name it, it sort of opens your mind up a little bit. And there we are trying to tell people not to worry about things. Can't see them. You're not the only people experiencing it. And then we're
don't worry, because you are only popping up in your own reality. It is you are seeing. What the heck? Well, that I think is the most creepiest moment. The moment that would spook me the most. Not to say it will make me pee in my pants right where I'm standing if I hold a camera and I see myself passing in front of the lens. That is nightmare stuff.
Right. Okay. Well, I'll share something with you. I'm going to share something with you, Maria, because if anybody else is watching this, I'll be sharing it with them as well. I did actually have an experience where I thought I saw myself, but I was probably. I'm trying to work it out. It's 19 or 20. And where I was living at the time, I was walking along the high street and I saw somebody on a motorbike. I had a motorbike at the time. In fact, it was a Honda CB200. It's my first motorbike. And it was a green one. So, okay, quite a common motorbike. That's nothing. But the chap wearing a jacket, well, it wasn't a biker jacket. It was more like a lumberjack type jacket, you know, a fleecy type jacket. Not the sort of thing that you'd sort of expect a biker to wear because they're normally leathers, but okay. The crash helmet was the same colour, jeans and boots. And if only I'd taken more sort of there'd been more attention at the time, I might have sort of run off this bloke or what I actually saw to see if I could actually see who it was. Because the probabilities, and I suppose somebody could work it out, what the probabilities of seeing somebody on the same motorbike, wearing the same clothes, same crash helmet, same boots, you know, it's not impossible, but you have to think in terms of probability. Yeah. And I mean, there are some, again, fascinating stories, you know, that I've heard firsthand of people that have had these sort of experiences where they've seen people, doppelgangers, you know, where they've actually seen people and said, I saw you in the shop. It's totally impossible because I was somewhere else. And yeah, and I won't go into one particular story, but there's one which I still find fascinating to this day. It is meant to be a true story, but, you know, okay, you'd have to take these things with a pinch of salt. And when you hear the story, you think, wow, you know, that it does actually suggest that people may have those sort of experiences of seeing not just ghosts in the sense that it's somebody that died years ago, but actually somebody that is sort of walking about and living.
Seeing yourself.
But seeing yourself.
How did that make you feel in that moment?
It was just weird. I mean, it's almost that you sort of stop in your tracks and you look at it and you try and evaluate it and you think to yourself, well, that's, you know, but when somebody's on a motorbike, you know, they're not hanging about, but you see that person. Now, it could be a case of misperception. It might just be that I just suddenly saw that thing and thought, you know, that looks like my motorbike. Oh, he's got a jacket like mine. But at that particular moment, it took on that reality. But yeah, it's a bit of a weird experience. And as I say, it's one that you'll never get the answer to. But it was fascinating because if the traffic lights perhaps up the street had turned red, then I might have been able to run up the road and verify we wouldn't be having this conversation now. But hey.
Does this experience influenced you to step into the paranormal and to investigate what might lie beyond our ordinary visions?
It is part of it, yes, I think so. I mean, it certainly wasn't necessarily the trigger. There have been other things that I've experienced, and you know that really can't be. Well, again, that's where you have to be careful. You say, oh, it can't possibly be explained, but there could be an explanation. I think one of the things that I look back, again, I was living on a flat on my own, and I went to bed, and I got into bed, and before I fell asleep, there was a thump on the side of the bed. The bed moved. I mean, there's no doubt that I could feel the bed moving. So the pillow came over my head, and I just was absolutely, well, shit scared. I mean, there's no other answer to it. I think now, if it happened to me now, I'd be jumping out of bed and, you know, I'd be really excited and trying to do something better. But when, again, the fear factor, living on my own, nobody else in the house, you know, and something like that happens, you just can't explain it. Now, it could be the property was old. There could perhaps have been a bit of movement at that particular time in old buildings. They settle, they do all sorts of strange things. It could have been that, but it certainly felt as though somebody coming up from the side of the bed and given it a good shove sideways. And I think that's probably the scariest moment.
And a very physical encounter with something that was invisible.
Yeah. No.
I would be that terrified that I probably shut down the room. But first I took my bed out and placed it into another room and then nailed it shut. Nobody is going into that room again,
Yeah.
ever.
Yeah.
So, oh my God, no, that would be okay. That's beyond words. When you experience something like that, once I was laying in my bed, and this is a couple of months ago, and I always have my laptop or my tablet in front of me, watching creepy movies and video clips on YouTube, and just passing the time. And suddenly something was touching my neck, and my husband was on that side, and he couldn't be the one who was touching me.
Yes.
So, and I was going like, what? And then I felt it walk across my arm. It was a mouse. Serious. But in that moment, I was going like,
Yes.
oh God. But it was simply a mouse, courageous enough to crawl up my arm and nibble in my neck. Come on. Okay.
Yeah.
Nick, crisis apparitions. Have you ever experienced one? And what do you think that they are?
Not personally, no. I've not had a crisis apparition. I've met people that have had some sort of experiences where there has been, I suppose you've described communication, obviously, but again, the particular story that this person, so it was a first-hand experience. This isn't a third-hand or something. I've read about this. This is somebody that's had something happen. But again, there were a lot of associations. Now, it wasn't actually an apparition. It was actually an object that triggered it. So it's not as though you hear the stories about the phantom or whatever you like to call it at the foot of the bed, and it turns out the person just died or anything like this. But for that person, and again, you have to respect their opinion. It was almost like a crisis apparition. It was that somebody that had died and that they were actually trying to communicate with them and giving them signs. But then you do say, you have to, in your own mind, I suppose, you're thinking about it and thinking, well, is it just coincidence? Are they making that association and building the story up from what they've just experienced? But then, again, we go back, crisis apparitions. It seems as though the First World War was a big trigger for that, and there's so many stories, and after the First World War, and again, you still come across it. I say, again, crisis apparitions, people's experience. My wife, my mother-in-law, unfortunately, my sister-in-law was killed in a car accident about 40 years ago, when she was very young, and my wife felt that there were a number of occasions where she could feel her close to her. Scent was one of them, a particular perfume that she used. My mother-in-law swears blind that she heard her say, "I'm all right," heard her voice. But again, you're talking about psychological factors, possibly, nothing tangible. So you do have to ask yourself, is it a kind of reaction? And I think that from research that's been done, I think there's people out there will probably know Cal Cooper, Dr. Cal Cooper, and he gave a fantastic talk a couple of years ago that I was lucky to see at the Ghost Club, and he was talking about people's experiencing close bereavement. And it's fascinating to hear the number of people that have those sort of experiences. And it takes many forms, like the smells, the sound of a voice. But something like 60% of people, when asked, I think that's off the top of my head, so I have to be a bit careful, actually claim to have had some sort of experience or feel they've had some sort of communication with somebody that's died very close to them, you know, a close relative. So it's again, is it a psychological factor, or is there actually something there? And I think the thing is that
perhaps this, what I just asked you about telepathy, and could it be a primordial language that we use without our awareness, but we do in the moment that there is a crisis. For instance, now I'm talking about 2-3 years ago. I was home alone, and I believe I have explained this situation before. I was home alone. My family was visiting my late mother-in-law in the Netherlands, and I was here in Germany. Home alone, I was watching television, just a boring detective series, so nothing creepy. And suddenly in front of me there was my desk with my computer, and there was a cell phone laying in there, and then an extreme loud bang. So startled as I was, I took out everything that was in that desk, and the screen of my phone, that phone was laying there, was broken into pieces. So, okay, strange. I go on with watching this very boring detective series. Okay, I hadn't anything better to do at that moment. So, and suddenly I felt this energy building up next to me. I was sitting on the couch, and in front of me was the saloon table, and between the couch and the saloon table next to me, I believe an arm length. And this energy was starting to build up and piling up higher and higher and higher, until I felt that this was a young man, very young man. I believe it was in his early 30s. But the odd thing was, he was was Caucasian, dressed in black clothing, and his head was like this. And he was only doing this. And I had this fear from, okay, when are you going to make the scare jump for me? You know, but he was standing like somebody I did not know. And that hold it on for a couple of minutes, and then it faded away. So a few days later, somebody rang my doorbell, my front doorbell, and there were 2 women. One I knew, and the other one I barely knew. And what they were telling was that one of the women, her son, had hang himself, like suicide. And the description I gave from this young man standing next to me, and the description of the woman giving from her son, were identical. I never saw this young man. I never knew this young man. I never met him. So when you are saying that a crisis apparition is 9 out of 10 times, or 8 out of 10 times, always connected to somebody that you know, then how can you explain, for instance, because I have several of these moments, these experiences, how can you explain something like this as a paranormal investigator?
Yeah, I can't. Again, it's something that you hear about. I can't say that your experiences actually were of that particular person, the deceased person, the person that hung themselves. I mean, I listen to it and I find it fascinating, and again, that's one of the reasons why I sort of am involved with this, but I can't give an explanation. You know, it seems like it's a bit of a cop-out. It sounds very weak, but that's why you persevere and you dig and you talk to people like yourself, or you hear about people that have these experiences, and you sort of try and evaluate and try and figure out, well, what are the balance of probability that, you know, it's just an hallucination, or that there was actually something that happened that was actually paranormal. And I sometimes think, you know, perhaps it's perhaps in some ways we're always looking for questions, or looking for answers to questions. And I think, in all fairness, there are times when you say, I can't give you an answer.
No.
And that's the honest truth. But then equally, you know, that's one story. I could give you 100 more, not obviously that of that type, of experiences that people had. Time slips. Somebody you saw recently who disappeared into the loft for 2 hours, thought he'd only been up there 5 minutes. Now, perfectly good standing, this chap. You know, he's not going to be lying because of his occupation. You know, he's a lawyer, and so he's not going to sort of make. But
Wait a minute.
okay, all right.
Okay, let's skip that. Okay, fine.
But equally, I know it's a different story, but equally, it's fascinating. You know, that people come to. You know, he said his sister was downstairs and said, well, where the hell were you? You know, this is obviously when he was a lad and he'd been up in the loft. He said, well, I was up in the loft for 5 minutes. No, you were up there for 2 hours. You know, it's things like this that, you know, so you accumulate these nuggets of information, these stories. You try and make sense of it. And I'm not always sure that you can. You try and piece it together. You come up with some theories. But at some point, hopefully in the future, that people will be able to explain it. You know, perhaps at some point in the future, you know, somebody will be able to sort of dip into your brain and explain exactly what you experienced. All right, okay, perhaps that's not such a good idea. But you know,
Okay.
I'm thinking about
I was imagining
what else will they find?
my skull and with a cracker and dipping into my brain. Okay, no, that's not a good thing to
Like
think
Dippy
about.
egg. You know, I mean, but it is, isn't it? You know, you just, but then you start thinking that, okay, perhaps in a scientific way, science doesn't work on balance of probability, but are we really looking at science? Are we looking at perhaps a philosophical point of view that, you know, the weight of evidence suggests that, you know, there is something weird happening, you know, people that the time slip thing, you know, and all of this kind of stuff. You know, it happens to too many people, you know, and I think, again, the interesting thing is sometimes when it's validated, difficult to validate your story. So it's an interesting one. I'm not doubting it, as we would say to any client. We're not questioning it, you know, anything like that. But it's the validation. If somebody had been sitting with you, there's always that thing. If somebody had been sitting with you and they'd seen exactly the same, or you had your camera or something and you got the picture, you know, and it's that.
In mine experience, in this experience, like I said, I had several. I called to the Netherlands. I called to my husband and I told him this is going on this moment, or what is going on at your side of the world, because
Yes.
that's a very big distance. So I did. Well, nobody was there physically, but on the phone. Well, it was happening. So I can imagine that the mother was, by means of being in contact with the other woman who I knew, was sending out her or transmitting her thoughts or grief and etc. sorrow, and that is what I picked up and created this energetic and amplified image of her son. But the only thing is that I personally cannot explain is I have never seen this young man, but I could describe him perfectly in detail as you recognize this description. So that is a very strange thing that paranormal investigators, parapsychologists, like for instance Dr. Dean Radin, should have the ability to investigate and to research and listen to these stories, collect them, and see if there is a logic pattern for these events, for these experiences. Nick, I'm so sorry, but I see that we have passed the hour.
Oh,
I can go on and on about this. I find this topic so fascinating. Last, I was talking with Lynn Kathleen Russell about near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences. Oh my God, I can go on for hours with that. So, but I have only that much time for your podcast to broadcast. So I like to thank you for this fascinating and amazing interview. But before we close out, can you tell us where we can find more information about your investigations you conduct with your colleagues, where we can find information about PRI-UK, perhaps maybe a television series?
Maybe. I think probably the best, I say, source of information. I think originally we were the paranormal investigators with a sixth sense of humour. I think you coined that phrase, which is absolutely fantastic.
Good one.
If anybody wants a sixth sense of humour approach to the paranormal, our podcasts. So if you can find our website, there are links. We're on Podbean, by the way. So I think there are about 14, maybe more than that. Might be more than that. We're due to do some more. But by all means, listen. It's a bit tongue in cheek, and it's very ad hoc. So it's not scripted, and you'll also be able to hear Andy rather than my voice as well. So as I say, he's a sensible one.
I will put the links down in the description. I will put the links down in the description.
Excellent, that's great, fantastic. Thank you very much. But great talking to you, Maria, and I think we need to talk again very soon.
I'd like to thank you all for tuning in today on the Next Truth podcast's Let's Ask Questions. Make sure to visit our website. That is www.nexttruth.com. That is nexttruth, all in one word, .com. And let us know what you think about our podcasts. While you're at it, if you find value in this show, we would appreciate a rating on our website in the section Testimonials. Or subscribe to our YouTube channel and share the links on your social media. I am Marianne van Driel with the Next Truth. Let's Ask Questions. Be sure to stay tuned for our next episode.